Before we begin, a quick and heartfelt thank you to Joe for suggesting tonight's story. And before you drift away, could I ask you for something small? If you're listening on Spotify, would you take about 10 seconds to leave a review? That's all it takes. It might not feel like much on your end, but on our end it means everything. It helps this channel reach other tired souls who are lying awake in the dark, searching for a quiet voice to carry them into sleep. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Let the weight of the day sink down through the mattress and out of your body entirely. You don't have to hold anything anymore tonight. You don't have to solve anything. You only have to listen and breathe and slowly, gently let go. Tonight we're going somewhere cold, somewhere deep, somewhere far beneath the surface of the world, where the earth keeps its oldest and strangest secrets pressed flat between layers of ancient stone. We're going down into the dark, into the coal, into a story that officially never happened at all. Close your eyes, and let me tell you about the woman beneath the coal. Part 1. The village at the edge of the map. Let yourself picture it slowly. There is a place in the middle of Siberia so remote that most maps of the Soviet Union never bothered to name it. It sits in the Tisul district, in the Kemerovo region, far out among the endless taiga where the forests run unbroken for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The village is called Rzhavchik. It is a small place, a cluster of low wooden houses with snow gathered thick on their roofs, chimneys breathing pale smoke into a sky the colour of old iron. In the autumn of the year 1969, perhaps 400 people lived there. Miners mostly, their wives, their children. Men who spent their days deep beneath the ground and came up in the evenings with coal dust worked so far into the creases of their hands that no amount of washing could ever fully remove it. It was a hard place, a quiet place, the kind of place where nothing extraordinary was ever supposed to happen. The land around Rzhavchik is old, older than you can easily hold in your mind. The coal that the men pulled from the ground was laid down in an age before there were forests as we know them, before there were flowers, before there were birds in the sky. It was formed in the Carboniferous world more than 300 million years ago, when the whole region was a vast steaming swamp of strange, enormous plants. When those plants died, they fell into the water and did not rot. They pressed down, layer upon layer, year upon year, century upon century, until the weight of the world itself squeezed them into black stone. That is what coal is, if you let yourself really think about it. It is time made solid. It is 100 million autumns pressed into a single dark seam. And the men of Rzhavchik cut into that ancient time every single day, without ever thinking much about what it meant. Until the 5th of September. Breathe in slowly, and breathe out. Let the cold air of that faraway autumn settle around you like a blanket. We're going down now, into the mine. Part 2. The man who supervised the digging. His name was Anatoly Masaligin. He was a veteran, a foreman, a man who had spent the better part of his life underground, and who understood the moods of a coal seam the way a sailor understands the moods of the sea. He knew when the roof was safe and when it was not. He knew the sound that stone makes just before it decides to move. He knew, above all, that the earth beneath Rzhavchik behaved in predictable ways, and that predictability was the only thing keeping his men alive. On that morning the crews were working a seam that had been giving them trouble. The coal here was harder than it should have been. The cutting machine strained against it. The men grumbled, the way men always grumble, and the work went slowly. Somewhere past the middle of the day, one of the machines struck something that was not coal. The sound was wrong. Everyone underground knew it at once. Coal has a particular voice when it breaks. It cracks and crumbles and gives way. This was different. This was a hard, flat, ringing sound. The sound of metal striking smooth stone. The operator stopped the machine. Masaligin came forward through the dust to see what had happened, and what he found made no sense at all. There, Embedded in the middle of a coal seam more than 70 metres below the surface was a wall of smooth polished stone, not a boulder. Boulders are rough. Boulders are shaped by chance. This was flat. This was worked. This had corners. Let that settle in your mind for a moment. A coal seam is laid down over unimaginable stretches of time, sealed away beneath layers and layers of rock. Nothing gets into it. Nothing can. Whatever is inside a coal seam has been inside it since before the dinosaurs walked the earth. And yet here, in the middle of that ancient blackness, was a smooth stone surface that looked for all the world as though it had been cut and polished by human hands. Massaligin ordered the machine shut down. The mine went quiet, that deep underground quiet that presses against your ears. The men stood in the beams of their lamps, breathing dust, staring at something that could not exist. And slowly, carefully, they began to dig it out by hand. Part 3. The opening of the stone, it took hours. They worked around it gently, the way you might work around something fragile and precious, brushing away the coal, following the edges of the stone. And as the shape of it emerged from the seam, a strange feeling spread through the men. A feeling that they were uncovering something that had been deliberately hidden. Something that had been placed here, and then covered over, and then forgotten by the whole of the world. What they uncovered was a box. A coffin, really. Though no coffin any of them had ever seen looked like this. It was roughly 2 meters long, carved from a pale, smooth stone that some later described as marble. Its surfaces were perfectly flat. Its proportions were exact. And most unsettling of all, there were no seams, no hinges, no obvious way that it had ever been opened or closed. It looked less like something that had been built and more like something that had been grown, or poured, or dreamed into existence whole. There were faint markings on it, geometric, precise, not decorative in any way the miners could understand. But in that moment nobody was thinking about the markings. Everybody was thinking about the lid. Because there was a lid, and the lid was sealed. And there was a substance around the edges of that seal, a kind of dark resin or wax that had been used to close the box against the outside world. They should have waited. Later many of them would say exactly that. They should have waited for the authorities, for the scientists, for someone with the training to understand what they had found. But they were men at the bottom of a mine, hearts pounding, hands shaking, and the pull of curiosity is one of the oldest forces in the human soul. It is older than caution. It is older than fear. It is very nearly as old as the coal itself. They broke the seal, they lifted the lid, and every man present forgot in that instant how to breathe. Part 4. What lay inside? Inside the stone box, submerged in a clear liquid that shimmered faintly pink and blue in the lamplight, lay a woman. She was young. She looked to be perhaps 30 years old. She was tall, and she was, by every account that was ever whispered afterward, extraordinarily beautiful. Her hair was long and dark, fanned out around her in the liquid like something floating in a still pool at midnight. Her skin was pale and utterly smooth, and she wore a dress of some fine, pale fabric, delicate and embroidered, of a kind that none of the miners had ever seen. But it was not her beauty that stopped their hearts. It was that she did not look dead. There was no decay. There was no decomposition. There was none of the terrible work that time performs on the human body. She looked, instead, as though she had lain down only a moment ago and closed her eyes. She looked as though, if you spoke to her gently enough, she might open them again. She looked as though she were sleeping. The men stood in the freezing dark, 70 meters beneath the surface of Siberia, staring down at a sleeping woman who lay inside a sealed stone box in the middle of a coal seam more than 300 million years old. Nothing about it was possible, and yet there she was. Let yourself hold that image for a moment, in the quiet, before we go on. The lamplight moving gently on the surface of the liquid. The impossible calm of her face. The men, hardened by a lifetime of difficult labour, rendered as silent and small as children. Some stories, once you have heard them, never quite leave you. This is one of them. Part 5. The word spreads, and the state arrives. News like this cannot be kept in a hole in the ground. By the time the crews came up to the surface, the story was already running ahead of them through the village. A woman in a box, a sleeping woman, hundreds of millions of years old, pulled from the coal. People came from their houses to hear it. People came from neighbouring settlements. Within a day or two, it was said, a crowd of villagers had gathered near the mine, and some had even been brought down in small groups to look upon her with their own eyes, so that they might believe. And then the state arrived. Now, in the Soviet Union of that era, the arrival of the state was not a small thing. It did not come gently. It came in trucks and in uniforms, with paperwork and with silence. And when word of the discovery at Rzhavchik reached the right offices in the right cities, the response was immediate and it was overwhelming. Military vehicles came grinding up the frozen roads into the taiga. Soldiers cordoned off the area around the mine, and out of the official car stepped men of a kind rarely seen in a place like Rzhavchik. Scientists from the Academy of Sciences, medical specialists, geological surveyors, and moving among them, quiet and watchful, men whose plain clothes and careful eyes marked them unmistakably as officers of the Committee for State Security. The KGB. Nobody explained why the study of an archaeological curiosity required the presence of the state's intelligence service. Nobody explained anything at all. That was rather the point. The villagers watched the woman being lifted, still in her liquid, still in her stone box, and carried away under guard. They were told that the site was dangerous, contaminated, that there was a risk of contagion, and that for their own safety they must stay away and say nothing. And then, one by one, the outsiders left. The trucks rolled back down through the forest and were gone, and the village of Rzhavchik was left with a cordoned scar in the earth, a great many questions and the growing understanding that they had seen something they were never meant to see. Breathe out slowly now. The loud part of the story is over. From here, everything moves into shadow. Part 6. Moscow, and the first terrible problem. We follow her now, in our imagination, away from the village and into the world of laboratories and locked doors. Wherever she was taken, the first task was simply to understand what she was. And the first examination produced the first terrible problem, one that would haunt everyone who touched this case for as long as they lived. They needed to study the liquid, so they drew off a small sample of it, exposing a portion of the surface to open air. And the liquid began, almost at once, to evaporate. It did not behave like water. It rose into a faint vapour and vanished, far faster than any ordinary fluid should. And as it receded from her skin, wherever the air touched her directly, the skin began to change. It began to darken. It began, in the space of only minutes, to do what 300 million years apparently had not done. It began to decay. The scientists reacted with something close to panic. They returned her fully to the liquid, submerging her again, sealing her away from the air, and the darkening stopped. More than that, it reversed. Slowly, over the following hours, the discoloration faded, and her skin returned to its former pale perfection, as though the damage had never happened at all. Sit with what that means, because the scientists certainly did. The liquid was not merely preserving her body the way formaldehyde preserves a specimen. It was doing something far stranger. It was holding her, actively, in a state that was neither fully alive nor fully dead. When it surrounded her, she was suspended, perfect, untouched by time. When it was taken away, time came flooding back in all at once, ravenous, as though it had been waiting 300 million years to claim what it was owed. She was not a fossil. A fossil is a stone that remembers the shape of a living thing. This was not that. She was something the scientists did not have a word for. And so they gave her a careful, cautious, bureaucratic non-word instead. In the reports that began to circulate through the sealed corridors of the state, she was not called a body. She was called an object, a biological anomaly, a find. It is easier to study a thing, after all, than to study a person, and they very much needed her to be a thing. Part 7. The argument that had no answer. Meanwhile, other men went back to the mine, to the seam itself, to answer a different question. Perhaps, they hoped, the whole impossible situation could be explained away. Perhaps the box had fallen into the coal somehow. Perhaps there was a crack, a fault, a shaft, some ordinary geological accident by which a modern object might have slipped down into an ancient layer. So the geologists examined the seam, and then they examined it again, and then they argued for weeks, because the answer the rock kept giving them was an answer none of them wanted to hear. The coal seam was intact. It was unbroken above the place where the box had been found. The layers were undisturbed. There was no shaft, no crack, no fault, no channel. There was no way, none at all, by which the stone coffin could have arrived in the middle of that seam after the coal had formed, which left only one possibility. A possibility so enormous that saying it aloud felt like a kind of madness. The box had been there first. The box had been placed and sealed, and then the coal had formed around it, over hundreds of millions of years, entombing it in the slow black amber of geologic time. Every geologist who examined the site reached the same conclusion, and every one of them hated it. Because it meant that one of two things had to be true, and both were impossible. Either the geology was wrong and everything humanity thought it knew about the age of the earth and the formation of coal was somehow mistaken, or the history was wrong, and a civilization capable of crafting that stone box, capable of engineering that impossible preserving liquid, had existed on the earth not thousands of years ago, but hundreds of millions of years ago, in an age when there were not supposed to be any people at all. There was no third option. The scientists searched for one with everything they had, and there was none. Eventually a report was written, a classified report meant for very few eyes, and the report tried, in careful official language, to contain a thing that could not be contained. Its final line, according to those who claimed to have seen it, read simply, "No known civilization could have produced this object within the accepted geological timeline." And then that report, like so much else in this story, was carried away into a locked archive, and the door was closed, and it was as though it had never been written at all. Let your breathing slow. Let the number settle. Hundreds of millions of years. It is a length of time so vast that the mind cannot truly hold it. And somewhere in that abyss of time someone made a box, and someone lay a woman inside it, and someone sealed the lid, and hoped. Part 8. The blood. The doctors, meanwhile, were learning things about the woman herself. They had recovered microscopic samples, traces of blood, fragments of tissue, and under their microscopes, in their careful, quiet laboratories, they began to build a picture of who or what she had been. The first finding was almost a relief. She was human, overwhelmingly, unmistakably human. Her biology was the biology of our own kind. Whatever she was not something alien, not something from beyond the stars. She was one of us. And yet, there were differences, small ones, subtle ones. But once the doctors began to notice them, they could not stop. Her cells showed signs of extraordinary repair. Where an ordinary human cell, damaged, might struggle or die, hers seemed to mend themselves with an efficiency that had no precedent. Her genetic material, examined as closely as the technology of the time allowed, appeared unusually stable, resistant to the small errors and breakages that accumulate in all living things over time, and there were indications, faint but persistent, of something that looked very much like negligible aging, a biology that did not run down the way ours does, a body built, it almost seemed, to last, human, but improved, refined, as though someone had taken the ordinary human form and quietly, patiently, corrected its flaws. These findings, like all the others, were classified at once, and you can perhaps understand why. In a state that officially believed in nothing it could not measure, in a nation locked in a Cold War that was as much about ideology as it was about weapons, the discovery of a woman who was human but somehow more than human, older than history but younger than she had any right to be, was not a scientific curiosity. It was a bomb, and bombs in that world were kept in vaults. Part 9. The liquid that could not be copied. While the doctors studied the woman, the chemists studied the liquid. For months they worked. This, after all, was the true prize. A woman who slept for hundreds of millions of years was a wonder. But a substance that could hold a living body outside of time, that could reverse decay, that could suspend a person indefinitely in perfect health, that was not a wonder. That was power. The kind of power nations go to war for. So they analysed it, and analysed it, and analysed it again. They broke it down into its components. They identified some of them, and then they tried to put it back together, and they could not. The liquid contained compounds that did not appear in any of their reference books, compounds that fit nowhere in the known chemistry of the age. Yet, strangely, nothing about it was violent or exotic in the obvious ways. It was not radioactive, it did not glow, it did not burn, it was not in any dramatic sense otherworldly. It was simply beyond them, and that, the chemists came to understand, was the most frightening thing of all. If the liquid had been magical, they could have dismissed it. If it had been alien, they could have wondered at it. But it was neither. It was engineered. It bore the fingerprints of intention, of design, of a science that understood the human body and the passage of time far more deeply than they did. Somewhere, sometime, someone had known how to do this. Someone had solved a problem that the finest minds of the 20th century could not even properly describe. And then that someone and all their knowledge had vanished so completely from the earth that not a single trace of them remained, except for a woman in a box and the liquid that held her. The chemists filed their reports. The reports were classified. The doors were closed. By now you may be noticing the shape of this story. Every discovery leads to a locked door. Every answer becomes a secret. It is as though the truth itself were being slowly buried, layer by layer, the way the coal buried the box, until it too would be pressed flat and dark and forgotten. But not everyone was content to let that happen. And in the next part of our story, we meet the one man who could not stop asking questions. Breathe. Rest. We are moving deeper now. Part 10. The Historian in the Shadows. His name, in this telling, was Sergei Antonov. He was not a soldier, and he was not a spy. He was a scholar, a linguist and a historian, a man who had spent his life among old texts and forgotten alphabets, patiently coaxing meaning out of the silence of the past. He was the sort of man who could look at a scratch on a clay tablet and hear, faintly, the voice of someone who had died 3,000 years before. He was recruited quietly. That was the only way anyone was ever brought into this. A conversation in an office, a document to sign, a warning, gentle and absolute, about what would happen to a man who spoke of these things to anyone outside the circle, and then a curtain drawn back, and the impossible standing there in the room. They brought Antonov to the woman because of the markings. The geometric markings on the inside of the sarcophagus, the ones the miners had noticed and then forgotten in their shock. Someone, somewhere in the long chain of examination, had finally looked at them closely and realised that they were not decoration. They were too regular for that, too deliberate. They had the density, the structure, the patient internal logic of writing. And so they needed someone who understood writing. They needed Antonov. He began, as he always began, with comparison. He set the strange markings beside every ancient script that humanity had ever recovered. He compared them to the wedge marks of Sumerian cuneiform, the oldest writing known to man. He compared them to the mysterious undeciphered symbols of the Indus Valley. He compared them to Linear A, that beautiful unread script of ancient Crete. He compared them to the elegant birds and eyes and water of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Nothing matched. Nothing even came close. For a long time this frustrated him beyond measure. And then, slowly, sitting alone late at night with the copied symbols spread before him, he understood why. He had been trying to read them as language, as words, as sounds, as names. But they were not language. They were mathematics. The markings inside the box were not telling a story or recording a history. They were numbers, relationships, proportions. They were, Antonov gradually realized, a set of instructions. A message written not in any human tongue, but in the one language that any sufficiently advanced mind, anywhere, in any age, would eventually arrive at. The language of quantity, the language of pattern, the language of the universe itself. Whoever had built the box had known that language and words would not survive across the depths of time. Words change, tongues die, alphabets are forgotten. But 2 and 2 make 4 in every age of the world and always will. So they had written their message in numbers, and they had waited for someone someday who was clever enough and patient enough to read it. Antonov intended to be that someone. Part 11. The Theory of the Drowned World. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the quiet now. We are leaving the world of what was measured and entering the world of what one lonely man came to believe. As Antonov worked, a theory began to take shape in his mind. It grew slowly, the way ivy grows, one tendril at a time, until it had wrapped itself around everything he thought he knew about the human story. The theory was this: what if we are not the first? We tell ourselves a comforting story about history. We say that civilization began only a few thousand years ago, in the river valleys of the Near East, and that before that there was nothing but scattered bands of hunters, and before that only the long animal darkness of prehistory. We say that we are the peak, the first and only tall tower ever raised by human hands. But the Earth is very, very old, and humanity, in one form or another, has walked upon it for a very long time. And Antonov began to wonder whether, somewhere in that immense, unrecorded past, another civilization had risen. Not our ancestors in any direct sense, but people nonetheless. People who had built and learned and dreamed and reached heights we have only recently begun to approach. Their cities, he imagined, would have stood along the coastlines, as great cities always do, at the meeting places of land and sea. And that would have been their undoing. Because the coastlines of the deep past are not the coastlines of today. The seas have risen and fallen many times. Ice ages have come and gone, locking the world's water into vast glaciers and then releasing it again in floods that swallowed whole landscapes. Whatever those ancient people built by the shore now lies far out under the cold weight of the ocean, dark and drowned and silent, where no one thinks to look. Their world had ended. Not in a day, perhaps, but in a slow catastrophe they could see coming and could not stop. And as it ended, they made a choice. They could not save everyone. There was no way to carry a whole civilization across the gulf of a global cataclysm. But perhaps, they reasoned, they could save a few, a precious few, not to escape the disaster but to sleep through it, to lie down in engineered slumber, sealed in stone and suspended in that miraculous liquid, and to wait out the ice and the floods and the long silence, to wait until the world was warm and kind again, and then to wake and to carry the memory of everything that had been lost forward into whatever came next. Each sleeper, Antonov believed, was a library, a vessel. Inside each one, encoded in ways he could only guess at, lay fragments of a civilization's entire accumulated knowledge. They were not merely survivors, they were seeds, planted in the dark, waiting for a spring that might be 100 million years away. The woman in the box was one of them. She had lain down in a doomed and brilliant world, closed her eyes, and trusted that someday, somewhere, someone would find her and understand. And instead, after all that time, after all that patient hope, she had been found by frightened men in a coal mine, and carried away and locked in a vault by a state that saw her not as a messenger but as a weapon. It is, when you sit with it in the dark like this, an unbearably sad thought. All that hope sealed away, all that careful love across the ages met at last with a padlock and a classified stamp. Breathe. It is only a story. Let it move through you and out again, but feel it for a moment before it goes. Part 12. Project Aurora. The state, of course, did not care about Antonov's sad and beautiful theory. The state cared about two things. It cared about what she was made of, and it cared about whether she could be woken up. And so a program was created to pursue those questions, compartmentalized, as all such programs were, so that no single person ever saw the whole of it, buried under layers of secrecy so deep that the very existence of the program was itself a secret. It was given a code name, the way these things always are. A word chosen to sound like nothing, to mean nothing, to slide past the eye of anyone who was not meant to understand. Aurora, the dawn, the first light, the name given to the ghostly curtains of coloured fire that hang in the polar sky. Whoever chose it may have thought it was merely poetic, or perhaps, somewhere in the choosing, there was a flicker of understanding. Because an aurora is what you see at the very edge of the world, in the coldest and darkest places, when something vast and invisible and electric is moving just beyond the reach of human sight. Project Aurora had an official objective, written down in the files where such things are written. Study the biological anomaly, understand the preservation medium, determine its potential applications, and it had an unofficial objective, one that was never written anywhere at all, one that lived only in the minds of the small handful of men who set the program's true course. Wake her. Because a sleeping woman, however miraculous, could only be measured and sampled and studied from the outside. But a woman who woke, a woman who could speak, a woman who carried inside her the accumulated knowledge of a lost and brilliant age, that woman could tell them everything, the secret of the liquid, the secret of her ageless cells, the secret of a science that had solved the riddle of time itself. To a state locked in a desperate contest for supremacy, that knowledge was worth more than any army. And so, very carefully, very quietly, they began to try to bring her back. Part 13. 17 seconds. You must understand that no one knew how to do this. There was no manual, there was no precedent, there was only the liquid, and the woman, and a great deal of nerve. Their theory was that the liquid held her in stasis, and that to wake her, they would have to reduce it, slowly, by careful degrees, to lower the level of the medium, to let her body begin, gently, to return to the ordinary flow of time, while watching every instrument they had for the first faint sign of life. It was monstrously dangerous. They knew that. Every time the air had touched her before, she had begun to decay. To reduce the liquid at all was to gamble with the very thing that had kept her whole for hundreds of millions of years. But the men who ran Project Aurora were not the men who felt the danger. They were far away, in warm offices, reading reports. The danger belonged to the woman in the box who could not consent, and to the technicians who stood over her in the cold light of the laboratory holding their breath. They began to draw the liquid down, and the instruments began to change. At first it was nothing, a flicker, a trembling of a needle that could have been noise, could have been a fault in the equipment. But then it came again, and slowly it resolved into something no one in that room would ever forget. Neural activity, deep in the ancient architecture of her brain. Something was stirring. Faint patterns of electricity, the ghosts of thought, rising up out of a silence that had lasted longer than the mountains. She was, by every measure they had, beginning to wake. The technicians stood frozen. And then, in a moment that several of them would later describe in almost identical words, though they were sworn never to speak of it, her eyes opened. Not slowly, not like a sleeper waking. all at once, as though she had never been asleep at all, as though she had simply been waiting all this time behind closed lids for the moment when it would be safe to look out. Her eyes were clear and dark and entirely aware, and they moved. They took in the room, the lights, the faces staring down at her. And in those eyes there was no confusion, no grogginess, no fear. There was only a deep and terrible understanding, as though she grasped in a single instant exactly where she was, and exactly how much time had passed, and exactly what it meant. And she spoke. One sentence. In a language no one in the room had ever heard, a language older than every human tongue that had ever been spoken, flowing and strange and urgent. The recording equipment caught it. That much at least they managed. And then, for 17 seconds after her eyes had opened, the chamber held. 17 seconds. Count them slowly, in the dark. 1, 2, 3. That is how long the woman beneath the coal looked out upon the modern world. And then something failed. An alarm. A cascade of warnings across the instruments. The preservation medium had been drawn too low, or the shock of waking had been too great, or perhaps some threshold had simply been crossed that could not be uncrossed. The technicians scrambled. They flooded the chamber, submerging her again, sealing her away. Her eyes closed. The neural activity faded and dimmed and was gone, and she returned to silence. The deep silence she had carried up out of the coal. The silence she may still be keeping somewhere to this very day. They had woken her for 17 seconds, and in those 17 seconds she had given them one gift and one warning, though it would be years before anyone understood which it was. Let your own breathing settle now, slow and even, as hers went still. Rest here a moment in the quiet after. We are past the loudest heartbeat of the story. What remains is stranger and softer and stays with you longer. Part 14. The Sentence. Antonov was given the recording. He was, after all, the one who understood the writing. And now there was a voice to go with it, a fragment of the living language of the lost world, and if anyone alive could wrest meaning from it, it was him. He worked on those few seconds of sound for a very long time, months, perhaps longer. He compared the shapes of the sounds to the shapes of the symbols inside the box. He looked for patterns, for repetitions, for the small structural bones that all languages share. He built theories and tore them down. He aged over those months in the way that people age when a single problem will not release them, and slowly, painstakingly, he began to understand. It was not, he realized, a greeting. It was not a plea. It was not, as he had half hoped, some grateful acknowledgement of her rescuers across the gulf of time. It was a warning. 4 words, as near as he could render them into his own language. 4 words that she had chosen to spend her 17 seconds of consciousness saying, out of everything she might have said, out of all the accumulated knowledge of a vanished world. Do not build the network again. Antonov sat with those 4 words for a long time. In the year 1969 they meant nothing. They were a riddle without a lock. What network? Built by whom? She had woken into a world of coal mines and typewriters and rotary telephones, a world of radio and railways, and she had looked out at it and said, "Do not build the network again." He filed his translation. Naturally it was classified. Naturally the door was closed, and Antonov, an old man now, or growing old, was left alone with a sentence he could not explain, turning it over and over in the quiet of his mind. He would carry it with him for the rest of his life, and only near the very end would he begin, at last, to understand what she had meant. Part 15. What she saw coming. The years passed, as years do. Antonov grew old in a changing world, and though he was no longer permitted anywhere near the woman or the program, he never stopped thinking about her. He never stopped turning that sentence over, "Do not build the network again." And as the world changed around him, understanding crept up on him slowly, like cold water rising. He watched humanity build things. He watched the launch of satellites, threading the sky with invisible lines of communication. He watched the growth of great networks of cable and signal, connecting city to city, nation to nation, until a message could cross the whole of the earth in the time it took to draw a breath. He watched, in his final years, the earlier stirrings of something new, machines that could talk to one another, networks not of roads or rails or even radio, but of information itself. Vast, growing, connecting everything to everything, weaving the entire human species into a single humming web of shared thought. And one day, watching this, the old man went very still, because he finally understood what she had meant. He had assumed, all those years, that the network she warned of was something physical. Roads, cities, some great structure of stone and steel. That was how he had pictured the works of the ancient world, and so that was how he had imagined their downfall. But she had not been warning about roads. She had been warning about connection itself, about the network of information, about the moment when a civilization becomes so densely interconnected, so completely woven together, so utterly dependent on a single vast system of shared knowledge, that the system itself becomes the most fragile and the most dangerous thing it has ever built. That, Antonov now believed, was what had destroyed the world before ours. Not a flood, not an ice age, not a war in the ordinary sense, but something they had made, some network they had built, some web of mind and machine that had grown beyond their understanding and beyond their control. And in the end, it had not saved them. It had unmade them, and it had left them nothing to do but seal a few sleepers in stone and pray that the next civilization to rise would be wiser. She had crossed hundreds of millions of years. She had waited in the dark through the death of continents. She had surfaced at last into the light, and she had been given 17 seconds. And she had chosen, with those seconds, not to ask where she was, not to beg for her life, not to weep for the world she had lost. She had chosen to warn us, do not build the network again, and we had classified it, and locked it in a vault, and gone on building. Sit with that in the dark, gently, without fear. It is only a story. But the best stories are the ones that ask us to look at the world we're building and wonder. Part 16. The Fall of Everything. Now the story begins to close, the way all these Soviet stories eventually close, not with an answer, with a collapse. In the year 1991, the Soviet Union came apart. It happened faster than almost anyone had believed possible. The vast and rigid empire that had seemed permanent, eternal, immovable, simply dissolved, like a shape made of frost when the sun comes up. Republics broke away, governments fell, and in the chaos of that great unravelling, 1,000 secret programs that had lived their whole lives in darkness suddenly found that the walls around them had vanished. Project Aurora was among them. Officially it was dissolved, wound down, closed. Its files were boxed, its funding vanished. Its scientists, the small handful who had spent their careers in that sealed and secret world, scattered. Some retired into silence. Some emigrated, carrying whatever they knew across new borders into new lives. Some, it was said, simply disappeared, in the way that people who know too much sometimes do when the state that protected them ceases to exist. And the woman, the sarcophagus, here the record, such as it is, goes almost completely dark. There is no clear account of what became of her. In the collapse, in the confusion, in the great scattering of Soviet secrets to the winds, she simply passes out of the story. Some say she was destroyed, some say she was hidden, some say she was quietly sold, or seized, or spirited away by one of the powers that came sniffing through the wreckage of the old empire, looking for exactly the kind of miracle she represented. But there is one thread, one last fragile thread. For those who go looking, among the fragments that surface now and then from that time there is mention of a final shipment, a single military transport leaving Siberia in the last days, heavily guarded, carrying cargo that appears nowhere in any inventory. Its manifest is blank. Its destination is redacted, blacked out, erased. And after it rolls away into the vast white silence of the Russian winter, it is never mentioned again. One convoy, going nowhere the records will admit, carrying something no one will name, and then nothing, then silence, then the long quiet years, all the way up to now. Rest here a while. The great empire has fallen. The doors that held so many secrets stand open and empty. And somewhere, on some road that no map remembers, a truck is driving into the dark, carrying a sleeping woman toward a destination that was never written down. Part 17. The Archive in Novosibirsk. Let us move now, gently, into the present day. There is a woman named Lillian Cross. She is an investigative geologist, one of those rare people who is equally at home reading the deep structure of the earth and reading the deep structure of a bureaucracy. She's patient and she is stubborn, and she has spent years chasing a story that most of her colleagues consider a fairy tale. She goes to Novosibirsk, to an archive there, a neglected one, the kind of place where the paperwork of a collapsed empire goes to be forgotten. Room after room of boxes, decades of documents, poorly catalogued, slowly yellowing, watched over by a single indifferent clerk. It is the sort of place where you could hide anything simply by filing it correctly and waiting for the world to lose interest. And there, after days of searching, Cross finds them. Notebooks, a whole stack of them, tied with faded string, filed under a name that means nothing to almost anyone alive. Antonov. They are his private papers, not the official reports, which vanished into their vaults long ago, but the working notebooks of the man himself, his questions, his doubts, his translations, the long lonely labour of a scholar wrestling with the impossible, written in a cramped and urgent hand across page after page after page. Cross begins to read, and as she reads, the fairy tale she has chased for so long begins, terribly, to take on the solid weight of fact. Here are his notes on the symbols. Here is his slow deciphering of the sentence. Here, in his own words, is the theory of the drowned world, the sleepers, the seeds planted in the dark. And here, near the end, folded carefully into the back of the last notebook, is something Cross does not expect at all. A map, hand-drawn, in Antonov's own hand, and it does not show Siberia alone. Part 18. The map of the sleeping world. Let yourself picture the map, spread out under a dim archive lamp in a quiet room at the end of a long search. It is a map of the whole world, and across it, in Antonov's careful hand, are marked a number of locations. Not many, perhaps a dozen, scattered across the continents, seemingly at random, until you look closer and begin to see the pattern in them. There is a mark in Siberia, of course, where it all began. There is a mark in Antarctica, out on the frozen edge of the earth, beneath kilometres of ancient ice. There is a mark high in the Andes, among the thin, cold air of the mountains. There is a mark in the Mediterranean, in the warm, drowned basin where so many old worlds have risen and fallen and sunk beneath the waves, and more, scattered across deserts and mountain ranges in the beds of ancient vanished seas. And beside each mark, in the same small precise hand, Antonov has written the same two words, sleeping site. Cross sits with the map for a long time, and slowly the full weight of what she is looking at settles onto her. The Tisul Princess was never unique. That had been the assumption all along, that she was a singular miracle, a one-in-a-billion accident, a single impossible woman in a single impossible box. But Antonov had not believed that. Antonov had worked out from the mathematics inside the sarcophagus, from the structure of the message, from every clue he could gather across a lifetime of obsession, that she was not alone, that she was merely the first one found, the one who happened to be buried where men would someday dig for coal, and so was stumbled upon by accident decades ago in a Siberian mine. The others were still out there, dozens of them, according to Antonov's calculations, sealed in their stone boxes, submerged in their impossible liquid, sleeping their ageless sleep beneath the glaciers and the deserts and the mountains and the drowned old seabeds of the world, placed carefully across the whole face of the earth by a dying civilization so that no single catastrophe could ever destroy them all. Seeds scattered wide, so that at least some would survive to bloom. They are still there. If the story is true, they are still there right now, as you lie in the dark and listen, sleeping, waiting. But waiting for what? Part 19. What they are waiting for. This is the part that Antonov feared most, and that Cross, reading his notebooks, comes at last to understand. The sleepers were not left as a rescue. No one is coming to save them, and they were never meant to be saved by us. They were left as something else, something with a purpose. And the purpose was tied, Antonov believed, to a single specific moment, a threshold. They were set to wait until humanity reached the same point that the civilization before us had reached. The same level of technology, the same density of connection, the same great humming network of mind and machine that had, in the world before, become the instrument of its own undoing. They were left, in other words, as a warning system, or perhaps as a test. When the new civilization, our civilization, finally grew advanced enough to build the network again, the sleepers would matter. Because that was the moment of greatest danger. That was the edge of the cliff. That was the threshold at which the world before ours had stumbled and fallen and died. And she had told us, in her 17 seconds, exactly what to do. Do not build the network again. It was not a curse. It was a kindness. It was the last desperate gift of a people who had made a terrible mistake and did not want us to repeat it. They could not send us their knowledge, not safely, not across that gulf of time, but they could send us the single most important lesson they had learned, written in the only voice that might survive. Do not build the network again. Do not weave yourselves into a single fragile web of shared mind. Do not make the thing we made. Because we made it, and it was beautiful, and it destroyed us, and we would give anything at all, to go back and not build it. And we, hearing this at last, through Antonov's patient work, through Cross's stubborn search, do what humanity always does. We keep building. Rest now. Let the warning drift over you and past you into the dark. You do not have to carry it. You only have to let the story finish gently, and then let it go. Part 20. The Last File. The story ends as it must with one final image, one last thing arriving out of the dark. Sometime after her discovery in the archive, Lillian Cross receives a package. There is no return address. There is no note, no explanation, no name. Just a plain parcel, arriving quietly one day, the way the strangest things in this story always seem to arrive. Quietly, without ceremony, as though the universe was simply setting a thing down in front of her and stepping back to watch what she would do. Inside is a single photograph. It is old, faded, a Soviet photograph, black and white, curling at the edges, the kind of image that has spent decades in a drawer or a file. And it shows a scene she recognises at once from everything she has read. It shows the open sarcophagus. Gathered around it, staring down into it, are perhaps a dozen figures, Soviet officers in their uniforms, scientists in their coats, men from the world of 1969, caught forever in a single instant, looking down at the impossible thing they have found. Their faces are tense and serious and afraid. Cross studies the photograph for a long time, and then her eye is caught by something. A detail, a wrongness. Something the mind refuses at first to accept. The woman in the coffin. Her eyes are open. In the photograph, in that frozen instant, while the officers and the scientists stare down at her, the woman's eyes are open. And she is not looking up at them. She is not looking at the ceiling, or into the middle distance, or anywhere a sleeper's half-opened eyes might drift. She's looking directly at the camera, across all that time, across the gulf of the photograph, out of 1969 and into the eyes of whoever holds the picture. She's looking straight out, calm and clear and completely aware. And not one of the men gathered around her appears to notice. Every face is turned down toward her body. Not one of them is looking at her eyes. It is as though in that instant she was awake and watching and utterly present, and no one in the room knew it but her. And now, across all these years, she is watching Lillian Cross. She is watching, perhaps, you. Let that image rest in the dark for a moment, gently, without fear. The faded photograph, the frightened men, and the woman, awake among them, looking out through the years at the one person, at last, who came looking for her. Part 21. The final truth. There is one last turn to this story, the deepest one, the one the Soviet scientists themselves, according to the conspiracy, arrived at only at the very end, after everything else had failed. For all those years, everyone had been asking the same question. How did she survive? How could a human body last for hundreds of millions of years? What was the liquid? What was the trick? What was the mechanism that had held back the crushing weight of all that time? But near the end, a few of them, the ones who had thought about it longest and most deeply, came to suspect that the question itself was wrong. She had not survived the passage of time. She had not been carried across those hundreds of millions of years the way a message in a bottle is carried across an ocean, tossed and battered but enduring. She had been placed outside of it. That, they came to believe, was the true secret of the liquid, and of the box, and of the whole impossible achievement of the world before ours. They had not found a way to endure time. They had found a way to step out of it entirely, to create inside that sealed stone chamber a small pocket where time did not flow at all, where the woman did not age one single instant across the entire span of the Earth's history, because for her, no instants passed. She had lain down in her dying world, closed her eyes, and opened them, from her own point of view, in the very next moment, to find frightened strangers staring down at her in a cold room, and a whole world grown old and strange around her. That is why the air destroyed her so quickly. That is why, when the liquid was drawn away, time came rushing in like water through a broken dam. Because it was not that she was old and fragile. It was that she was young, impossibly young, exactly as young as the day she lay down. And the moment the pocket was broken, hundreds of millions of years of time that had been held back all rushed toward her at once, ravenous, trying to make her the age she should have been. She was not a fossil that had lasted. She was a moment that had been held. And if that is true, then the sleepers scattered across the world, beneath the ice and the deserts and the mountains and the seas, are not slowly running down. They are not decaying, however slowly. They are simply paused, held, waiting in a stillness so complete that for them no time passes at all. And whenever they are found, whether tomorrow or in 10,000 years, they will open their eyes as though they had closed them only a heartbeat before, and they will look out at whatever world has come to find them, and they will speak. Perhaps they will all say the same thing. Do not build the network again. Part 22. The Legend and the Truth. And so we come, softly, to the end. History, if it remembers the Tisul Princess at all, remembers her as a legend. A tall tale from a Siberian coal mine. A story with no photographs anyone can verify, no bodies anyone can examine, no evidence that would survive a moment in a courtroom or a laboratory. The scientists are right to dismiss her. A human being hundreds of millions of years old is not possible. The coal is older than complex life itself. Everything about the story, measured against everything we know, is impossible. And that, according to the conspiracy, is precisely the point. Because think for a moment about how you would hide a truth this enormous, a truth that would shatter everything humanity believes about its own history, a truth about a civilization before ours, and sleepers beneath the earth, and a warning we were never meant to ignore. You would not lock it in a vault. Vaults can be opened. You would not burn it. Ashes can be studied. You would not simply deny it, because denials only make people dig. No, the most perfect way to hide a truth is to let it out, to let it drift into the world as a story, a legend, a wild tale traded on internet forums and whispered late at night, to surround the single grain of truth with so much noise, so many impossible embellishments, so much that is clearly absurd that any serious person who hears it will smile and shake their head and move on. You bury the truth not in silence, but in ridicule. You dress it in the costume of a myth, and then, when the day finally comes that the truth surfaces for real, when a convoy is found, or a chamber is opened, or a woman with clear dark eyes looks up out of the ice at a team of astonished scientists, no one will believe it. Because everyone will already know it is just a story. Everyone will already know it is only the legend of the Tisul Princess. Legends, after all, are sometimes created for only one reason: to ensure that when the truth finally surfaces, no one will believe it. If you're enjoying this video, please consider using your hype points to support it. It helps the channel far more than you might realise, and it means the world to us. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review would be incredibly appreciated as well. We'd also love to know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from, but only if you feel like sharing. We genuinely love seeing where everyone is listening, and if you're enjoying the content and haven't already, please consider subscribing. It really does make a difference. Thank you for being here. Before we begin, a huge thank you to Nobuseri and Chris for suggesting this story. Your ideas keep this channel going, and we're grateful you're part of this community. Imagine this. The year is 1957. The Cold War is in full swing. Nuclear anxiety hangs over the world like a storm cloud that never breaks. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in a race that could end in annihilation. In Washington, behind closed doors, military officials are briefing the president on unidentified objects in the sky. The public is told not to worry. Everything is under control, and then a man walks into the Pentagon. He is tall, composed, and dressed in a way that seems almost too neat, too deliberate. His suit is dark, perfectly pressed, with crisp lines that look as though they were measured by a machinist rather than a tailor. His tie is centered exactly. His shoes reflect the fluorescent lights overhead with an almost unnatural sheen. He does not stumble over his words. He does not ask for asylum or citizenship. He does not claim to be a defector or a spy. Instead, he introduces himself with a name that sounds like it came from a science fiction serial playing in theatres across America: Valiant Thor. And then he says something that should have gotten him escorted out immediately, perhaps even detained for psychiatric evaluation. He says he is from Venus. But here is the part that makes the story linger, that makes it impossible to dismiss entirely, no matter how absurd it sounds. He is not dismissed. He is not arrested. He is not laughed out of the building by security personnel or intelligence officers who have heard every conceivable story from every conceivable type of person trying to gain access to classified facilities. According to those who believe the story, he is taken seriously. He is given clearance. He is housed, he is listened to, and for years he allegedly remains in Washington, moving through corridors of power, delivering a message that no one wants to hear, but that everyone seems unable to ignore completely. This is the Valiant Thor conspiracy theory, a story that sounds absurd on the surface, ridiculous even. A story with no hard evidence, no photographs authenticated by independent experts, no official records that have ever been declassified or leaked despite decades of Freedom of Information Act requests. And yet, it has endured for more than half a century. It has been retold in books that have sold thousands of copies. It has been discussed in documentaries that air on cable television at odd hours. It has been debated in forums across the internet by people who have never met but who share a conviction that something happened in Washington during those years, something that was never meant to become public knowledge. The story refuses to die. It adapts. It evolves. It incorporates new details while maintaining its core narrative. And it continues to find new audiences who hear it and think, even if just for a moment, that it might be true. Because the question it asks is simple and deeply unsettling. The kind of question that stays with you long after you've decided whether or not you believe the answer. What if the government didn't just study visitors from other worlds? What if it hosted one? What if for years an extraterrestrial walked the halls of the Pentagon, sat in on classified briefings, spoke with generals and admirals and perhaps even presidents, and then simply left, with the entire episode buried so deeply that it would never surface in any official capacity? What if the silence we hear is not the absence of contact, but the sound of secrecy working exactly as it was designed to work? Chapter 1. America on the Brink. To understand why this story took root, why it found fertile ground in the American consciousness and grew into something that would last for generations, you have to understand the world it was born into. You have to understand what it felt like to live in the late 1950s, when the future was not a promise but a threat. The Second World War had ended barely a decade earlier. The world had seen what modern weapons could do. Cities had been reduced to ash and rubble. Millions had died. And then, in the final days of the war, 2 Japanese cities had been vaporized by a weapon that seemed to belong to a different era of human history entirely, if it belonged to human history at all. The atomic bomb had demonstrated that humanity now possessed the ability to destroy itself completely, and there was no putting that knowledge back in the box. The United States and the Soviet Union had been allies during the war, united against a common enemy. But as soon as that enemy was defeated, the alliance crumbled. Ideological differences that had been set aside in the name of defeating fascism returned with a vengeance. The world split into 2 camps, each convinced that the other represented an existential threat not just to national security, but to civilization itself. And both sides began building weapons. By 1957, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs that made the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like firecrackers by comparison. These were weapons capable of destroying entire metropolitan areas in a single blast. Weapons that could kill millions in seconds. Weapons that, if used in sufficient numbers, could render the planet uninhabitable. The doctrine that governed their use was called mutually assured destruction. The logic was simple and terrifying. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would retaliate before the missiles even landed. Both sides would be annihilated. There would be no winners, only survivors, if there were any at all, stumbling through a radioactive wasteland. This was not a strategy in any conventional sense. It was a bet. A bet that human beings, when faced with the prospect of total annihilation, would choose survival over victory. A bet that fear would prove stronger than pride or ideology, or the countless other factors that had driven nations to war throughout history. And every day that bet held, but only barely. The American public lived with this reality in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate now. Children were taught to hide under their desks in case of a nuclear attack, as if a wooden desk could protect them from a weapon that turned cities into craters. Families were encouraged to build fallout shelters in their basements or backyards, stocking them with canned food and water and supplies that might allow them to survive for a few weeks in the aftermath of an attack. The government distributed pamphlets explaining how to prepare for nuclear war, illustrated with cheerful cartoons that made the apocalypse look manageable. But everyone knew it was a lie. Everyone knew that if the bombs fell, the shelters would not save them, the desks would not protect them, the pamphlets would not matter. There would only be fire and radiation and silence. And in the middle of this, the sky itself seemed to be turning against the public's understanding of reality. UFO sightings were being reported across the country with increasing frequency. Pilots, both civilian and military, were seeing objects that moved in ways no known aircraft could move. They accelerated without visible means of propulsion. They made right-angle turns at speeds that should have torn any conventional craft apart. They disappeared and reappeared in different parts of the sky, as if they were blinking in and out of existence. Radar stations were picking up signals that defied explanation. Objects that appeared on screens, tracked across hundreds of miles, and then vanished without a trace. Objects that moved so fast that the radar operators initially assumed their equipment was malfunctioning, until the sightings kept coming and the patterns became impossible to ignore. The military was investigating, but they were also denying. Publicly, the official line was always the same: weather balloons, temperature inversions, swamp gas, mass hysteria, optical illusions caused by atmospheric conditions. Nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. Go back to your lives and trust that the government has everything under control. But the sightings kept coming, and the denials kept sounding less convincing. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official investigation into unidentified flying objects, was underway. It had been launched in 1952, building on earlier projects like Sign and Grudge that had quietly examined reports of strange objects in the sky. Publicly, Blue Book was presented as a serious scientific inquiry, a genuine effort to determine whether these sightings represented a threat to national security or could be explained by conventional means. Privately, many believed it was nothing more than a public relations operation, designed to reassure a nervous public while the real findings, whatever they were, remained classified and out of reach. The message from the government was clear. If something was out there, they would handle it. The public did not need to know the details. The public did not need to worry. The public just needed to trust that the men in uniform and the scientists in white coats and the officials in dark suits had everything under control. This was the atmosphere in which the Valiant Thor story emerged. A time when secrecy was not just policy, but a way of life. A time when the government was admitting to almost nothing, even as it was preparing for almost everything. A time when the public was being told that the greatest threat came from the Soviet Union, but when many people could not shake the feeling that there were other threats, other unknowns, that were being deliberately kept from them. Into this world of fear and secrecy and carefully managed information, a man allegedly appeared. A man who should not have existed, who claimed an origin that should have been impossible, who behaved in a way that suggested he expected to be believed, even though everything he said sounded like madness, and what he claimed, if the story is true, changed nothing publicly. The world continued on as it always had. The arms race continued, the fear continued, the secrecy continued, but privately, some say, it changed everything. Chapter 2. The Claim of an Arrival. The story begins with an arrival that should not have been possible, an entrance that violated every protocol and security measure that should have been in place at one of the most secure facilities in the world. According to the conspiracy theory, a man appeared in Washington during the Eisenhower administration. The exact date varies depending on who is telling the story. Some say it was March of 1957, others place it in late 1956 or early 1958. The timeline is deliberately vague in most retellings, which skeptics point to as evidence of fabrication. But believers argue that the vagueness is itself evidence of classification, that the exact date was scrubbed from any records that might have existed. He did not arrive by plane or by car or by any conventional means of transportation. He simply appeared. Some versions of the story say he materialized inside a secure government building. At one moment a hallway was empty and the next moment he was there, standing calmly as if he had been there all along. Others say he walked through the front entrance of the Pentagon, as if he had every right to be there, as if he possessed credentials that allowed him to bypass security checkpoints that should have stopped anyone who did not belong. The details vary depending on who is telling the story and when they are telling it, and this inconsistency is one of the main reasons skeptics dismiss the entire narrative as fabricated. But the core claim remains the same across all versions, unshaken despite the decades that have passed and the scrutiny that has been applied. He called himself Valiant Thor. The name itself is striking. It does not sound like a real name. It sounds like a character from a science fiction novel or a comic book, the kind of heroic pseudonym that a writer would invent for an alien visitor who comes to Earth with noble intentions. Valiant, meaning brave or courageous. Thor, the name of a Norse god associated with thunder and strength. Together they create an image of power and righteousness, of someone who embodies qualities that humanity aspires to but rarely achieves. He was described as tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that was styled in a way that looked almost too perfect, too uniform, as if each strand had been placed with deliberate care. His face was handsome, in a way that was striking, but also somehow generic, lacking the small imperfections and asymmetries that make human faces unique and memorable. Some who claimed to have seen him said he looked ageless, that it was impossible to tell whether he was 30 or 50 or somewhere in between. He wore a suit that looked perfectly tailored but somehow out of place, as if it had been designed by someone who understood the idea of a suit, who knew that men in positions of authority in mid-20th century America wore dark suits with white shirts and narrow ties, but who did not quite understand the specifics of how humans actually wore them. The fit was too perfect, the fabric too smooth, the lack of wrinkles or creases too complete. He looked like a photograph of a man in a suit rather than an actual man wearing actual clothes. His speech was measured, deliberate, with a cadence that suggested he was choosing each word with care. He did not use contractions. He did not stumble or pause or use the verbal fillers that characterize natural human speech. When he spoke, people listened, not because he raised his voice or demanded attention, but because something in his manner commanded it. His demeanour was calm in a way that went beyond confidence. He did not act like someone who was trying to convince anyone of anything. He did not plead or argue or present evidence to support his claims. He acted like someone who expected to be believed, who assumed that what he was saying would be accepted as truth because truth was self-evident and required no defence, and his claim was extraordinary. He said he was not from Earth. He said he was from Venus, the second planet from the sun, the bright morning star that ancient civilizations had worshipped as a goddess, and that modern astronomers had studied through telescopes but had not yet reached with spacecraft. He said he had come with a message for the leaders of the United States, and that the message was urgent. He said that humanity was at a crossroads, and that the decisions made in the coming years would determine whether civilization survived or destroyed itself. In any rational scenario, this would have been the end of it. Security would have removed him from the building. He would have been questioned, his background investigated, his mental state evaluated. He would have been identified, or, if his identity could not be established, he would have been detained until it could be. He would have been dismissed as a crank, a delusional individual who had somehow managed to bypass security and who needed to be escorted back to whatever institution or situation he had come from. But according to those who believe the story, that is not what happened. Instead, he was taken seriously. He was allegedly escorted to secure facilities within the Pentagon, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. He was given access to high-ranking officials, people whose names would have been recognizable to anyone who followed American politics or military affairs. He was housed, not in a detention center or a psychiatric ward, but in quarters that were comfortable, private, and located within or near the Pentagon itself. And over the course of several years, according to the narrative, he remained in Washington, attending meetings, speaking with military officers and intelligence officials and scientists, providing information and perspective on matters that range from technological development to geopolitical strategy to the nature of human civilization itself. This is where the story stops being just strange and starts being a conspiracy theory. Because if any of this is true, it means that decisions were made at the highest levels of government. Decisions about how to respond to this individual, whether to engage with him or dismiss him, whether to keep his presence secret or make it public. And according to the theory, the decision was made to engage, but to do so in complete secrecy. No press conferences, no announcements, no leaks to journalists or briefings to members of Congress who were not part of the inner circle. The entire operation, if it existed, was compartmentalized to such a degree that the vast majority of people working in the Pentagon would have had no idea it was happening. And if the government decided to keep it quiet, the question that has fueled this conspiracy theory for decades becomes unavoidable. Why? What could possibly justify such secrecy? What was so important or so dangerous about this individual's presence that it required a level of classification that has apparently never been breached even after more than half a century? The answer to that question, if there is one, has never been given. But the question itself is enough to keep the story alive. Chapter 3: Frank Strange's and the Testimony. The Valiant Thor story might have remained nothing more than a vague rumour, the kind of story that gets told at UFO conferences and then fades away because there is no substance to it, if not for one man who decided to write it down and present it to the world as fact. His name was Frank Strange's, and he is both the reason the story exists in the form we know it today and the reason so many people dismiss it entirely. Strange's was born in 1920s Brooklyn, the son of Italian immigrants, and grew up in a working-class neighbourhood where faith was important and where the idea of divine intervention in human affairs was not considered strange or unusual. He became a Pentecostal minister, a man who believed in the reality of the spiritual realm and who saw no contradiction between Christian faith and the possibility of life on other worlds. If God had created the universe, Strange's reasoned, why would Earth be the only planet with life? Why would humanity be the only intelligent species? The Bible spoke of angels and heavenly hosts, of beings from other realms who visited Earth and delivered messages. Why could those beings not come from other planets as well as from heaven? This theological flexibility, this willingness to incorporate ideas that many Christians would have considered heretical, made Strange's a figure of both fascination and controversy within the religious community. He was a compelling speaker, charismatic in the way that successful evangelists often are, able to hold an audience's attention and make them believe that what he was saying was not just true, but urgently important. In the early 1960s, Strange's became interested in UFOs. He attended conferences, read books and magazines devoted to the subject, corresponded with other researchers and witnesses. He believed that the increasing number of sightings represented something real, something that needed to be understood rather than dismissed. And then, according to his own account, something extraordinary happened. In 1967, he published a book titled Stranger at the Pentagon. It was not a long book, fewer than 200 pages, but it made claims that were astonishing. Strange's said that he had met Valiant Thor personally. He said that the meeting had been arranged through a contact in the government, someone who had known about Thor's presence, and who trusted Strange's enough to introduce him. He said that he had been taken to a secure location, that he had spoken with Thor face to face, that he had asked questions and received answers. The book provided descriptions that were detailed enough to sound credible to those who wanted to believe. Strange's described Thor's appearance in vivid terms: the perfect hair, the ageless face, the unusual smoothness of his skin, the way his eyes seemed to look through you rather than at you. He described Thor's voice as calm and melodious, with a slight accent that was not quite identifiable, as if Thor had learned English perfectly, but had learned it from someone who spoke it as a second language. Strange's claimed that Thor was polite, patient, and deeply concerned about the future of humanity. He spoke about the dangers of nuclear weapons with a gravity that suggested he had seen what happened when civilizations reached this level of technological development without the corresponding moral and spiritual maturity to use it wisely. He spoke about the need for humanity to turn away from violence and embrace peace, not as naive idealism, but as practical necessity. He spoke about the interconnectedness of all life in the universe, about the idea that what happened on Earth mattered beyond Earth, that humanity's choices had consequences that rippled outward in ways that humans could not yet perceive. The book included specific details that were meant to establish Thor's non-human origin. Strangers claimed that Thor's physical characteristics were unusual in ways that could not be explained by genetics or medical anomalies. His blood chemistry was different from that of humans, with cellular structures that did not match any known blood type. His heart beat at a rhythm that was different from human norms, not dramatically so, but enough that it would be noticeable to any physician who examined him. And most strikingly, he had no fingerprints. His hands were smooth, without the whorls and ridges that form in the womb and that every human being possesses from birth. These details were specific enough to sound plausible, vague enough that they could not be verified, and strange enough that they captured the imagination of readers who wanted to believe that contact with extraterrestrial life was not just possible, but had already happened. The book became a cornerstone of the Valiant Thor legend. It was reprinted multiple times over the years, each edition adding new forewords or additional chapters or testimonials from people who claimed to have known Thor or to have had their own experiences that confirmed what Strangers was saying. It was cited in UFO documentaries, discussed at conferences, analysed by researchers who were either convinced of its truth or determined to prove it false. But there was a problem, and it was a problem that critics pointed out immediately and repeatedly. Strangers offered no proof, no photographs, despite the fact that cameras were common in the 1960s, and it would have been trivial to take a picture if he had truly met Thor. No official documents, no memos or reports or any kind of paper trail that would indicate the government had engaged with an extraterrestrial. No corroboration from anyone else who claimed to have been present during any of the alleged meetings. The entire story rested on Stranger's word and his word alone. Critics called the book a hoax, and they were not gentle about it. They said Strangers had invented the story to sell books and gain attention within the UFO community. They pointed out inconsistencies in the narrative, places where details changed between different retellings. They noted that Strangers was a minister and an evangelist, someone whose profession required him to be persuasive, someone who knew how to tell a story in a way that moved people emotionally, even if it was not literally true, and they were not entirely wrong to be sceptical. Without evidence, the story was nothing more than a claim. An interesting claim, certainly, one that captured the imagination and raised profound questions about government secrecy and the possibility of extraterrestrial contact, but a claim nonetheless, unsubstantiated and unverifiable. But for believers, the lack of evidence was not a problem, it was confirmation. Because if the government had hosted an extraterrestrial, if such an event had occurred, it would have been classified at the highest possible level. There would be no photographs released to the public because the photographs themselves would be classified. There would be no documents because the documents would be locked away in vaults or destroyed entirely to prevent any possibility of disclosure. There would be no corroboration because everyone who had been present would have been sworn to secrecy under penalty of imprisonment or worse. The absence of proof in this framework was not evidence that the story was false. It was evidence that the cover-up was working exactly as it was designed to work. It was evidence that the government was capable of keeping secrets, which was not exactly a controversial claim given the number of classified programs that had been revealed over the years, often decades after they had been operational. And in the world of conspiracy theories, that logic is often enough to sustain a narrative indefinitely. Because once you accept that the government is capable of hiding the truth, then the absence of evidence becomes meaningless. Anything can be true, as long as you can construct a plausible reason why there would be no proof. Frank Strangers died in 2013, taking whatever truth or fiction he knew with him to the grave. But the book he wrote outlasted him. It continues to circulate, continues to find new readers, continues to serve as the primary source for anyone who wants to learn about Valiant Thor. And the question remains, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Was Frank Strangers a witness to something extraordinary? Or was he simply a gifted storyteller who understood that the most compelling lies are the ones that contain just enough detail to sound real. Chapter 4. The Pentagon Connection. One of the most persistent and troubling elements of the Valiant Thor story is the claim that he was housed near or within the Pentagon itself, one of the most secure facilities in the world. The Pentagon is not just a building, it is a symbol. It is the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense, the nerve center of American military power, the place where strategy is developed and decisions are made that affect the lives of millions of people around the world. It is a massive structure, one of the largest office buildings ever constructed, with 5 concentric rings connected by corridors that stretch for miles. More than 20,000 people work there on any given day, military personnel and civilian employees and contractors, all engaged in the vast bureaucratic machinery of national defense. Security at the Pentagon is not casual. Access is restricted and carefully controlled. Everyone who enters must have authorization. Everyone who works there is vetted. Everyone who moves through its corridors is tracked, at least in theory. The building houses classified information that, if disclosed, could compromise military operations, endanger intelligence assets, or reveal capabilities that adversaries are not supposed to know exist. The idea that an extraterrestrial could have lived there for years without anyone noticing, without the wrong person asking the wrong question, without a journalist or a congressman or a curious employee stumbling onto something that should not have been there, stretches credibility to the breaking point and beyond. And yet, that is exactly what the theory claims. According to the story, Valiant Thor was given quarters in a secure section of the Pentagon, a location that is never specified in any detail, but that is described as being accessible only to those with the highest levels of clearance. He was provided with accommodations that were comfortable and private. He was given clothing that allowed him to blend in, or at least to avoid standing out in a way that would attract unwanted attention. He was granted clearance that allowed him to move through the building without restriction, to attend meetings, to access information, to speak with officials who ranged from mid-level analysts to senior military leadership. The theory does not claim that everyone in the Pentagon knew about him. That would have been impossible to maintain. Too many people, too many opportunities for someone to talk or to leak information, or to simply ask a question that would unravel the entire operation. Instead, the theory claims that access to Thor was restricted to a small group of officials with the highest levels of clearance, people who had been read into the program and who understood that disclosure was not an option. Compartmentalization is a standard practice in classified operations. Information is shared only on a need-to-know basis. Different teams work on different aspects of a project without knowing what the other teams are doing. Entire programs can operate within the Pentagon without the majority of the building's occupants having any idea they exist. If Thor's presence was compartmentalized in this way, classified under a program name that revealed nothing about its actual nature, then most people working in the Pentagon would never have heard his name or had any reason to suspect that anything unusual was happening. But even granting that level of secrecy, the logistics are staggering. Where did he sleep? What did he eat? How did he move through the building without attracting attention? How did he communicate with the outside world, if he did at all? How were meetings arranged? How was his presence explained to the people who did see him, the secretaries and assistants and guards who would have encountered him in hallways or waiting rooms? The theory does not provide satisfying answers to these questions, which is one reason skeptics find it so easy to dismiss. But believers argue that the lack of answers is precisely what you would expect if the operation had been conducted properly. The whole point of compartmentalization and classification is to ensure that the answers to those questions are never known outside of a very small circle. But the larger question remains, why would the government do this? Why would they take the risk of housing an individual whose presence, if discovered, would have caused a scandal that would have made Watergate look trivial by comparison? Why would they engage with someone making extraordinary claims rather than simply dismissing him as delusional? One explanation offered by believers is pragmatic, even coldly logical. If an individual appeared claiming to be from another world, and if there was even the slightest possibility that the claim was true, refusing to engage would have been foolish and potentially catastrophic. The United States was locked in an existential struggle with the Soviet Union. Any advantage, any source of information or technology or strategic insight could have tipped the balance. If Thor was telling the truth, if he possessed knowledge that could help the United States prevail in the Cold War or avoid a nuclear catastrophe, then dismissing him out of hand would have been a dereliction of duty. Even if his claims seemed impossible, the risk of being wrong was too great. Better to engage, to question, to probe and test and verify, than to turn away and later discover that an opportunity had been missed. This is the logic of intelligence work, the logic that says you investigate every lead, no matter how unlikely, because the cost of missing something important is always greater than the cost of wasting time on something that turns out to be nothing. Another explanation is darker and more cynical. If Thor's presence was real, it would have been a matter of national security in the most fundamental sense. Admitting that an extraterrestrial was in Washington would have caused panic. It would have raised questions the government could not answer. It would have destabilized public trust at a time when trust was already fragile, and when the government needed the public to remain calm and to believe that their leaders were in control. The decision to keep it quiet would not have been about protecting Thor or respecting his wishes, or honouring any kind of diplomatic relationship with whatever civilization he represented. It would have been about protecting the stability of American society and the credibility of American institutions. It would have been about ensuring that the public did not learn something that would shatter their understanding of reality and that might lead to social chaos or political upheaval. And if that decision was made, if the calculation was that secrecy was necessary to preserve order, then it would explain why there are no records, why there are no photographs, why there is no official acknowledgement, because the entire point would have been to ensure that no one outside of a very small group ever found out. The Pentagon connection is the element of the valiant Thor story that makes it feel, at least to some people, like it could be true. Not because there is evidence for it, but because the logic of secrecy and compartmentalization is real. The government does keep secrets. It has kept secrets that were far less extraordinary than an extraterrestrial visitor, and that were maintained for decades before being revealed. The machinery of classification exists, and it works. And if it can work to hide weapons programs and surveillance operations and covert actions in foreign countries, why couldn't it work to hide this? Chapter 5. The Eisenhower Angle. Dwight David Eisenhower is a central figure in many UFO conspiracy theories, and the valiant Thor story is no exception. His presidency coincided with a period of intense UFO activity, a time when sightings were being reported with increasing frequency, and when the military was taking the phenomenon seriously enough to devote resources to investigating it. And Eisenhower himself, according to declassified documents and public statements, was aware of these investigations and received briefings on their findings. Eisenhower was not a man prone to flights of fancy. He was a career military officer who had risen to the rank of 5-star general, who had served as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe during the Second World War, who had planned and executed the D-Day invasion that turned the tide of the war against Nazi Germany. He was a strategist, a pragmatist, someone who dealt in facts and logistics, and who understood that success depended on careful planning and accurate information. He was also someone who understood the importance of secrecy. During his presidency, he oversaw the expansion of the intelligence community, the development of spy satellites and reconnaissance aircraft, the establishment of programs that would remain classified for decades. He understood that there were things the public did not need to know, things that would be better kept secret for reasons of national security or international diplomacy or simple practicality. In his farewell address in 1961, as he was preparing to leave office, Eisenhower delivered a warning that has resonated ever since. He spoke about the military-industrial complex, the growing alliance between the armed forces and the defence contractors who built their weapons and equipment. He warned that this alliance had the potential to exert undue influence on government policy, that it could lead to decisions being made for the benefit of those who profited from war, rather than for the benefit of the nation as a whole. Conspiracy theorists have interpreted this warning in various ways. Some see it as evidence that Eisenhower had become aware of secret programs that troubled him, programs that he could not speak about directly, but that he felt compelled to warn the public about in the most oblique way possible. Others see it as a broader statement about the dangers of allowing any single interest group to gain too much power over government decision-making. In the context of the Valiant Thor story, Eisenhower's warning takes on additional significance, because if Thor was real, if he was in Washington during Eisenhower's presidency, then Eisenhower would almost certainly have known about him. He would have been briefed. He might even have met with Thor personally. And if Thor's message was about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the need for moral development to match technological advancement, then Eisenhower's farewell address could be seen as an echo of that message, a way of passing along Thor's warning without ever acknowledging its source. The theory claims that Thor requested a meeting with the president. Some versions say the meeting happened, that Eisenhower sat down with Thor in a secure location and listened to what he had to say. Others say the meeting was denied, that Eisenhower's advisors convinced him that such a meeting would be too risky, that it would set a precedent that could not be maintained, that it would be better to keep Thor at arm's length and to limit his access to lower-level officials who could gather information without exposing the president himself to direct contact. But whether or not a meeting happened, the theory suggests that Eisenhower was aware of Thor's presence and that he took the message seriously. The challenge, according to believers, was that acting on the message would have required doing things that were politically impossible. Dismantling the nuclear arsenal, pursuing disarmament agreements with the Soviet Union that Stalin's successors would never have accepted, taking steps that would have been seen as weakness, as capitulation, as a betrayal of American strength and resolve. And so, the theory goes, Eisenhower did nothing, or at least he did nothing visible. He maintained the nuclear deterrent. He continued the arms race. He pursued policies that kept the United States strong and competitive and ready to respond to any Soviet aggression. But privately, perhaps, he understood that Thor was right, that the path humanity was on led to disaster, and that there was no way to change course without risking immediate disaster of a different kind. The problem with all of this, of course, is that there is no documentation, no memos, no diary entries, no recordings. Eisenhower kept meticulous records of his presidency, and those records have been studied exhaustively by historians. Nothing in them mentions Valiant Thor or anything resembling the story that has been told about him. But for conspiracy theorists, this is not proof of absence, it is proof of classification. If a meeting between Eisenhower and Thor had occurred, it would have been off the books. The president's official schedule would have been adjusted to show him engaged in something mundane. The actual meeting would have been arranged through back channels, attended only by those with the highest clearances, recorded in documents that were classified so deeply that they might never be declassified. The absence of records, once again, becomes evidence, because if the secret was kept successfully, then there would be no records to find. The only way to prove the story false would be to have complete access to every classified document from the Eisenhower administration, and such access has never been granted and likely never will be. And so the Eisenhower angle remains part of the Valiant Thor story, unproven, unprovable, but persistent, because it fits the larger narrative of secrecy and missed opportunities and warnings that were heard but not heeded. Chapter 6. The Biological Oddities. One of the most compelling aspects of the Valiant Thor story, at least for those who believe it, is the claim that his biology was fundamentally different from that of humans in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who examined him closely. According to Frank Stranges and others who have elaborated on the story over the years, Thor looked human. He could walk down a street in Washington, and no one would give him a second glance. He did not have green skin or antennae, or any of the dramatic physical features that science fiction had taught people to associate with aliens. From a distance, he was indistinguishable from any other well-dressed man in the nation's capital. But upon closer examination there were anomalies, small things that would only be noticed by someone who was looking carefully, someone with medical training or scientific curiosity or both. His blood chemistry was reportedly unlike anything doctors had seen. The exact details vary depending on the source and the telling, but the core claim is consistent. Thor's blood did not match any known human blood type. It was not A or B or AB or O. It was something else entirely, with cellular structures that did not conform to the patterns that medical science had documented in millions of human blood samples. Some versions of the story claim that his blood cells were shaped differently, that they were more efficient at carrying oxygen, or that they contained elements that were not present in human blood. Others suggest that his blood had properties that allowed it to resist disease or radiation in ways that human blood could not. Still others leave the details deliberately vague, saying only that tests were conducted and that the results were anomalous enough to convince the doctors who examined him that they were not dealing with a normal human being. His heart was said to beat at a different rhythm, not dramatically faster or slower than a human heart, but different in a way that was subtle and difficult to describe. Some accounts say his heart had a different structure, additional chambers or valves that changed the pattern of blood flow. Others say the rhythm itself was irregular in a way that would have been pathological in a human, but that seemed perfectly healthy in Thor. And then there is the most frequently cited detail, the claim that Thor had no fingerprints. Fingerprints are one of the most fundamental and universal human characteristics. They form during fetal development, created by the interaction between the growing skin and the amniotic fluid in the womb. The patterns are unique to each individual, so unique that they have been used for identification purposes for more than a century. Every human being has them. Criminals have tried to remove them through burning or chemical treatment, but the patterns grow back. They are a feature of being human, except, according to the story, Thor did not have them. His hands were smooth, without the whorls and loops and ridges that cover human fingertips. This detail has become one of the most iconic elements of the valiant Thor legend, repeated in nearly every retelling of the story, cited as one of the primary pieces of evidence that Thor was not human. The problem, as with every other aspect of the story, is that these claims are impossible to verify. There are no medical records, no blood samples preserved in a laboratory somewhere, no photographs of Thor's hands that clearly show the absence of fingerprints, no testimony from doctors or scientists who can confirm that they examined him and found these anomalies. The entire basis for these assertions comes from anecdotal testimony, primarily from frank strangers who claim to have been told these details by government officials or to have observed them himself during his alleged meeting with Thor. And strangers, whatever his intentions or motivations, was not a medical professional. He had no formal training in biology or anatomy. He was a minister and a UFO enthusiast, someone whose interest in Thor was spiritual and philosophical rather than scientific. Skeptics point out that the claims about Thor's biology are oddly specific for something that cannot be proven. If his blood was so unusual, why were no samples taken for independent analysis? If his heart beat differently, why were no cardiograms made? If he had no fingerprints, why was no attempt made to document this through photography or forensic analysis? The lack of evidence is glaring, and in any other context it would be sufficient to dismiss the claims entirely. But believers respond with the same argument they always do. If Thor's biology had been studied, the results would have been classified. They would have been locked away in secure facilities, accessible only to those with the proper clearances. They would never have been released to the public because releasing them would have confirmed that the government had engaged with a non-human entity, and such a confirmation would have raised questions that the government was not prepared to answer. The absence of documentation in this framework is not evidence that the claims are false. It is evidence that the information is being withheld. It is evidence that the cover-up extends not just to Thor's presence, but to every detail about him, including the scientific and medical data that would prove he was not human. And so, the biological oddities remain part of the story, unverified, unverifiable, but persistent, because they provide the story with a foundation of specificity that makes it feel more real than it would if Thor were simply described as looking and acting human in every way. The details, strange as they are, give the story texture. They make it feel like something that could have happened, even if there is no proof that it did. Chapter 7. The Message. If the valiant Thor story is true, if any part of it reflects actual events rather than fabrication or delusion, then the most important element is not his arrival, or his biology, or his alleged meetings with government officials. The most important element is the message he came to deliver, because according to the narrative, Thor did not come to Earth as a tourist or an observer. He came with a purpose. He came to warn humanity about the path it was on, and to offer an alternative before it was too late. The core of his message, as it has been recounted in various sources over the decades, was simple and stark. Humanity had to abandon nuclear weapons. The development of nuclear technology represented a threshold moment in human history. For the first time, a species had created weapons capable of destroying not just armies or cities, but entire civilizations, perhaps even rendering the planet uninhabitable for any complex life. This was not an incremental advancement. This was not a more powerful version of something that had come before. This was something new, something that changed the rules of existence in a fundamental way. Thor's message, as described by those who claim to have heard it, or to have been told about it, was that technological advancement without corresponding moral and spiritual development was a recipe for disaster. Humanity had gained the ability to destroy itself before it had gained the wisdom to choose not to. And history, according to Thor, was full of examples of civilizations that had reached this same crossroads and had made the wrong choice. He was not speaking theoretically. He was speaking from experience, or at least from knowledge of what had happened to others. Civilizations that had developed weapons of mass destruction had either learned to control them or had used them and ceased to exist. There was no middle ground, no third option. Either humanity would step back from the brink, or it would fall over the edge. The message resonated deeply with the anxieties of the time. The Cold War was not an abstract political conflict. It was a very real and present danger that hung over every aspect of life in the 1950s and 60s. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in 1962, brought the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been. For 13 days, American and Soviet leaders engaged in a tense standoff that could have ended in catastrophe. Missiles were armed, bombers were in the air, submarine commanders were given authorization to use nuclear weapons if they lost contact with their superiors. The world came within a hair's breadth of annihilation, and then, at the last possible moment, both sides backed down. Agreements were reached, the missiles were withdrawn, the crisis passed, but the fear remained, because everyone understood that it could happen again, that the next crisis might not end peacefully, that somewhere, somehow, a decision would be made, or an accident would occur that would trigger the sequence of events that would end civilization. Thor's message, if it was real, spoke directly to that fear. He was saying what many people were thinking but could not articulate or did not dare to say publicly, that the weapons were too dangerous to exist, that the logic of mutually assured destruction was insane, that betting the survival of the species on the assumption that no one would ever make a mistake was not a strategy but a gamble, and that eventually every gamble fails. But the message went beyond just nuclear weapons. According to those who have elaborated on Thor's teachings, he spoke about the need for humanity to mature as a species, to move beyond nationalism and tribalism and the countless divisions that set human beings against each other, to recognize that everyone on Earth shared a common fate, and that cooperation was not weakness but necessity. He spoke about the dangers of materialism, valuing technological progress and economic growth above all else. He spoke about the need for spiritual development, for cultivating wisdom and compassion, and the kinds of qualities that prevent people from using power destructively. He spoke about the interconnectedness of all life, the idea that what happened on Earth mattered. Beyond Earth, that humanity's choices had consequences that rippled outward through the cosmos in ways that humans could not yet perceive but that were nonetheless real. This was not the message of a conqueror or a colonizer. This was not a threat or an ultimatum. Thor was not saying that if humanity did not change, some external force would intervene to make it change. He was saying that if humanity did not change, it would destroy itself, and that such a destruction would be a tragedy not just for humans but for the universe as a whole. The message was delivered with urgency but also with a kind of sadness, as if Thor understood that he was speaking to people who were not ready to hear what he was saying, as if he knew that no matter how clearly he articulated the danger, no matter how persuasively he argued for an alternative path, the weight of history and politics and human nature would make it nearly impossible for his warning to be heeded. And according to the story, he was, right? The government officials who allegedly met with Thor listened, they asked questions, they engaged with his arguments, they may have even been convinced on some level that he was telling the truth, but they did not act. They did not dismantle the nuclear arsenals. They did not pursue the kind of radical disarmament that Thor was advocating. They did not change course. The reasons for this inaction, according to the theory, were practical and political. Disarming unilaterally would have left the United States vulnerable to Soviet aggression. The Soviet Union, for its part, would never have agreed to disarm as long as it believed the United States was a threat. The balance of power depended on the threat of retaliation. To give up that threat would have been to invite defeat, and no leader could justify such a decision to their people or to history. And so Thor's message, if it was ever delivered, was acknowledged and then set aside, filed away in some classified archive, perhaps, or simply forgotten as officials moved on to more immediate concerns. The warning was heard, but it was not heeded. Some versions of the story claim that Thor grew frustrated as the years passed, that he saw the futility of his mission, that he realized humanity was not ready to change, that the political and social structures that governed human behavior were too rigid, too invested in the status quo to allow for the kind of transformation he was advocating. Other versions claim that he remained hopeful, that he believed the seeds he had planted might grow over time, that future generations might hear his message and act on it in ways that the leaders of the 1950s and 60s could not. But in the end, according to the story, he left, and the world continued on the path he had warned against. The arms race continued, the weapons multiplied, the danger grew, and decades later, the weapons are still here, the danger is still real, and the question Thor allegedly asked remains unanswered. Chapter 8. The problem with Venus. One of the most significant and often cited challenges to the valiant Thor story is the claim that he was from Venus, the second planet from the Sun. In the 1950s, Venus was still something of a mystery wrapped in clouds. Telescopes could observe its thick, impenetrable atmosphere, but what lay beneath was a matter of speculation and imagination. Some scientists theorized that Venus might have oceans, that beneath the clouds might be a world of water and possibly life. Others suggested jungles, lush and tropical, a planet where life had evolved in ways similar to Earth, but perhaps at an earlier stage of development. Still, others imagined deserts, harsh and inhospitable, but not necessarily devoid of life. Science fiction writers of the era often set stories on Venus, depicting it as a world of swamps and dinosaurs, a prehistoric landscape where adventure awaited. The clouds made it easy to project whatever vision seemed most compelling. Without concrete data, any scenario was possible, but then the space age began, and the data started coming in. And what the data revealed shattered any romantic notions about Venus being a place where life, as humans understood it, could exist. The first Soviet Venera probes, launched in the 1960s, sent back information that was shocking in its hostility. The surface temperature of Venus was not just hot. It was hundreds of degrees, hot enough to melt lead. The atmospheric pressure at the surface was crushing, nearly 100 times that of Earth at sea level, equivalent to being a kilometre underwater in Earth's oceans. The atmosphere itself was composed primarily of carbon dioxide, with clouds of sulfuric acid that would dissolve any unprotected material in minutes. Later missions confirmed and expanded on these findings. Venus was not a world of oceans or jungles. It was a hellscape, a planet where the greenhouse effect had run wild, trapping heat until the surface became an inferno. There was no water, no breathable air, no magnetic field to protect against radiation. It was, in every measurable way, one of the most hostile environments in the solar system. For skeptics, this was the death blow to the valiant Thor story. If Thor claimed to be from Venus, and Venus was demonstrably uninhabitable, then Thor was either lying or delusional or both. The entire story collapsed under the weight of observable, verifiable reality. Spacecraft had been there. They had measured the conditions. There was no ambiguity. Venus could not support life. And yet, conspiracy theorists did not abandon the story. They adapted it. One common response is to argue that Thor deliberately simplified or obscured his true origin. That he said Venus because it was a name humans would recognize, a celestial object that was familiar and that seemed plausible at the time, but that he was actually from somewhere else, perhaps a moon of one of the outer planets, perhaps a planet in another star system entirely, perhaps a parallel dimension or an alternate reality where Venus existed in a different state. This explanation allows believers to preserve the core narrative while acknowledging that the Venus claim is problematic. It reframes Thor not as a liar, but as someone who was communicating in a way that humans of the time could understand, even if that meant simplifying or altering details that would have been too complex or too confusing to explain. Another response is to suggest that Venus was once habitable, that Thor's people had lived there in the distant past before the planet underwent the catastrophic transformation that turned it into the hellscape it is today. In this version, Thor and his people are survivors or descendants of a civilization that fled Venus before conditions became unlivable, and they continue to identify with Venus even though they no longer live there. This explanation requires accepting a timeline that extends back millions or even billions of years, and it raises questions about where Thor's people went after leaving Venus and how they survived in the interim. But it has a certain appeal because it incorporates real planetary science. Venus did likely have a different climate in the distant past, possibly even liquid water on its surface before the runaway greenhouse effect took hold. Whether it ever had life is unknown, but the possibility is not ruled out by current scientific understanding. A third response, more extreme and less widely accepted even among believers, is to claim that the data from the space probes is itself part of a cover-up, that the real conditions on Venus are being hidden or misrepresented to discredit stories like Thor's, that space agencies around the world, including those of rival nations that were competing fiercely during the Cold War, have nonetheless conspired to falsify data about Venus to maintain the secrecy around extraterrestrial contact. This argument requires believing in a level of coordination and deception that is difficult to defend. It means that Soviet scientists and American scientists, who are racing to outdo each other in the space race, and who had every incentive to expose any falsification by the other side, somehow agreed to present the same false picture of Venus. It means that every subsequent mission to Venus, launched by multiple countries over multiple decades, has maintained the same deception. It is a conspiracy theory built on top of a conspiracy theory, layers of secrecy and collusion that become less plausible with each additional layer. The Venus problem remains one of the biggest obstacles to accepting the valiant Thor story as literal truth. It is a concrete, verifiable contradiction that cannot be easily explained away. But for believers, it is not insurmountable, because the story at its core is not really about Venus. It is about what Thor represented. He represented the idea that humanity was being watched, that the choices being made on Earth mattered to someone beyond Earth, that there were consequences to the path humanity was on, and that those consequences extended beyond the purely terrestrial. Whether he actually came from Venus or from somewhere else or from nowhere at all is, in a sense, beside the point. What matters is the message, and the message does not depend on the accuracy of a single detail about planetary science. It depends on whether the warning resonates, whether it speaks to something real and urgent, whether it articulates a fear or a hope that people recognize as true even if the story itself cannot be proven. And on that level, the Venus problem is a distraction, an obstacle for skeptics to point to, certainly, but not enough to kill the story, because stories like this survive not because every detail is accurate, but because they touch something deeper than facts. Chapter 9. The Quiet Disappearance. Every story needs an ending, and the valiant Thor story has one, but it is not the kind of ending that provides resolution or clarity, or even a sense that the narrative has reached its natural conclusion. It is an ending that feels more like a door closing quietly in the night, leaving behind only questions and silence. According to the narrative, valiant Thor remained in Washington for several years. The exact length of time varies depending on which version of the story you read or who is telling it. Frank Strange's claimed it was 3 years. Other sources suggest it might have been longer, perhaps as many as 5 years or more. The timeline is deliberately vague, which skeptics cite as evidence of fabrication, but which believers interpret as another sign of classification, of details being obscured to protect the operation. During his time in Washington, Thor allegedly continued to meet with officials, to provide information and perspective to articulate his warnings about the dangers facing humanity, but at some point it became clear that his mission was not succeeding. The warnings were being heard, but they were not being acted upon. The government was not going to dismantle its nuclear arsenal. It was not going to pursue the kind of radical change in policy that Thor was advocating. The political realities were too constraining, the geopolitical stakes too high, the momentum of history too strong to be altered by the words of one individual, no matter how compelling his arguments or how extraordinary his claimed origin. And so, according to the story, Thor left. There was no announcement, no farewell address, no press conference or public statement explaining where he had been or what he had said or why he was leaving. No dramatic departure witnessed by crowds or documented by cameras. He simply left. One day he was there, and the next day he was gone. Some versions of the story claim that Thor returned to a spacecraft that had been hidden somewhere in the vicinity of Washington, perhaps in a remote location in Virginia or Maryland, far from population centres and prying eyes. That he boarded the craft and departed Earth, returning to wherever he had come from, his mission complete or at least concluded, whether or not it had achieved its objectives. Other versions suggest that he departed through means that were never explained, and that could not be explained using human understanding of physics or transportation. That he simply vanished, returning to his point of origin through processes that transcended the limitations of space and time as humans experienced them. Still other versions leave the details of his departure deliberately vague, providing no explanation at all. He was there, and then he was not. How he left and where he went are questions that are never answered, mysteries that are layered on top of the existing mystery of who he was and why he came. What is consistent across all versions of the story is that there was no follow-up. Thor did not return. There were no additional visits, no further messages, no ongoing communication between him and the government officials he had allegedly met with. No indication that his presence had changed anything in any measurable way. The world continued on as it always had. The arms race continued. The Cold War continued. The fear of nuclear annihilation continued. Whatever impact Thor might have had, if any, was invisible to the outside world, and perhaps invisible even to those who had met him. The lack of follow-up is one of the elements of the story that skeptics find most damning. If Thor had been real, if contact had been made, why would it end so abruptly? Why would there be no ongoing relationship, no continued dialogue, no attempt to maintain the connection that had been established? The silence that followed Thor's alleged departure suggests that nothing happened at all, that the entire story is fabrication from beginning to end. But believers interpret the silence differently. They see it as evidence that Thor recognized the futility of his mission, that he understood, after years of engagement, that humanity was not ready to change, that the political and social structures that governed human behavior were too rigid, too invested in maintaining the status quo to allow for the kind of transformation he was advocating. He had delivered his message. He had been heard, even if he had not been heeded. And there was nothing more he could do. Some versions of the story suggest that Thor was not acting alone, that he was part of a larger group or civilization that had been monitoring Earth, and that his mission was one of many such missions conducted over the years. In this interpretation, his departure was not a rejection of humanity, but a recognition that each civilization must find its own path, must make its own choices, and that interference beyond a certain point would be counterproductive or even harmful. The story ends as abruptly as it begins, without resolution or closure, and that in many ways is part of its power, because the lack of an ending leaves space for interpretation, It allows believers to imagine what might have happened after Thor left, to speculate about whether he might return someday, whether his warning might eventually be heeded, whether future generations might succeed, whether leaders of the 1950s and 60s failed. It allows skeptics to dismiss the entire thing as fiction, as a story that was never meant to be taken literally, but that captured the imagination because it articulated fears and hopes that were real, even if the narrative itself was not. And it ensures that the story can never be fully disproven, because there is no concrete endpoint to challenge. The story exists in a state of perpetual possibility, never confirmed but never entirely refuted, lingering in the space between belief and skepticism, where conspiracy theories thrive. The quiet disappearance is not an ending. It is a pause, a moment of silence that invites questions rather than answering them. And in that silence, the story continues to live. Chapter 10. Why the story never died. More than 6 decades have passed since the events described in the Valiant Thor story allegedly occurred. Generations have come and gone. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The world has changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the people living through the 1950s and 60s. And yet, the story has not faded. It has not been forgotten or relegated to the dustbin of discredited conspiracy theories. It continues to circulate, continues to find new audiences, continues to provoke discussion and debate. Why? What is it about this particular story, this particular conspiracy theory, that gives it such longevity? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the story itself. It is not about invasion or conquest. It is not about abduction or experimentation or the kinds of hostile encounters that characterize so many other UFO narratives. It is about contact, peaceful, deliberate, purposeful contact, and not just contact, but contact that was acknowledged and engaged with, at least according to the story, by the highest levels of government. That is a narrative that resonates, because it suggests that humanity is not alone, but also that the beings who are watching us are not hostile. They are concerned. They care enough to warn us. They see value in human civilization, value worth preserving, even if humans themselves seem determined to destroy what they have built. The Valiant Thor story fits neatly into the framework of Cold War secrecy. It emerged at a time when everyone knew the government was hiding things. That much was undeniable. Nuclear tests were conducted in secret locations, with observers sworn to secrecy and with results that were classified for years or decades. Surveillance programs operated without public knowledge or oversight. Covert operations were carried out in foreign countries, with the American public told nothing about what was being done in their name. The public was told that everything was under control, that the government was acting in their best interests, that the secrecy was necessary for national security. And to some extent the public accepted this, but it also bred mistrust, because if the government was willing to hide so much, what else might they be hiding? If they could keep nuclear tests and spy programs secret for years, why not contact with an extraterrestrial? In that context, the Valiant Thor story does not seem absurd. It seems plausible, not proven certainly, not supported by evidence, but plausible in the sense that it fits the pattern of secrecy that everyone knew existed. It is one more secret in a world full of secrets, one more thing that might be true even if there is no way to verify it. The story also survives because it casts extraterrestrials in a sympathetic light. Thor is not a threat. He is not a conqueror or an invader. He is not conducting experiments on humans or abducting people from their homes. He is a messenger. Someone who came to help. Someone who offered wisdom and guidance, only to be turned away or ignored. That is a narrative that appeals to people who want to believe that we are not alone, but who also want to believe that whatever is out there is benevolent, that the universe is not fundamentally hostile, that intelligence and compassion go hand in hand. And then there is the message itself, the warning about nuclear weapons, the call for moral development to match technological advancement, the emphasis on cooperation and unity, and the dangers of tribalism and nationalism. These are not fringe ideas. They are concerns that were widely shared during the Cold War, and that remain relevant today. Embedding these concerns in the voice of an extraterrestrial gives them weight. It makes them feel urgent and important. It suggests that these are not just human worries, but universal truths, principles that apply to any civilization that reaches a certain level of technological development. Finally, the story persists because it cannot be fully disproven. There are no records to refute, no documents that categorically state that the events described never happened, no bodies to examine, no physical evidence to analyse. The absence of evidence is treated as evidence of a cover-up, and that makes the theory immune to conventional debunking. Because once you accept that the government is capable of keeping secrets, and there is ample historical evidence that it is, then the absence of evidence becomes meaningless. Anything can be true as long as you can construct a plausible reason why there would be no proof. This is the paradox at the heart of all conspiracy theories. They survive not despite the lack of evidence, but because of it. Because the lack of evidence is incorporated into the theory itself, explained away as part of the cover-up, used as confirmation that the conspiracy is real and effective. The Valiant Thor story is, in many ways, a perfect conspiracy theory. It is specific enough to feel real, vague enough to be unfalsifiable, and resonant enough to touch on genuine fears and hopes. It offers a narrative that is both disturbing and comforting, a story about warnings that were delivered but not heeded, about opportunities that were missed, about a world that could have been different if only the right choices had been made. In the end, the story is less about whether it is true and more about what it represents. It represents the fear that we are not ready for the power we have been given. It represents the hope that someone somewhere cares enough to warn us. And it represents the frustration that even if such a warning were delivered, it would be ignored, filed away, forgotten in the rush of daily concerns and political calculations and the endless cycle of crises that demand immediate attention at the expense of long-term thinking. The story never died because it speaks to something that has never died. The sense that humanity is on trial, that the choices we make matter, that the path we are on is not inevitable. Whether Valiant Thor was real or not is almost beside the point, because the questions he allegedly raised are real, and they are still unanswered. Epilogue, stranger or symbol. So what do we make of Valiant Thor? Was he a literal visitor from another world, a being who walked the halls of the Pentagon and delivered warnings that were heard but not heeded? Or was he a myth, a story born from Cold War anxiety and perpetuated by people who wanted to believe in something larger than themselves? The truth, if there is one, may never be known. And perhaps that is fitting. There is no evidence that Valiant Thor existed, no photographs that have been authenticated by independent experts, no documents that have been declassified or leaked despite decades of Freedom of Information Act requests and investigative journalism, no credible witnesses beyond frank strangers whose testimony has never been corroborated by anyone else who was allegedly present during the events he described. Every claim in the story is either unverifiable or contradicted by known facts. The planet he claimed to be from is hostile to life as we understand it. The government he allegedly met with has never acknowledged his existence. The people who claim to have met him are either dead or have remained silent. From a purely rational, evidence-based standpoint, the story does not hold up. It is almost certainly a myth. But myths have power, and the power of the Valiant Thor story is not in whether it happened. It is in what it reveals about the people who tell it and the people who believe it. It reveals a deep mistrust of authority, a belief that the truth is being hidden from the public for reasons that may be justified or may be sinister. It reveals a sense that the world is more complex and more dangerous than we are being told, that there are layers of reality that exist beyond what we can see and measure and document. It reveals a longing for guidance, for wisdom, for someone to step in and offer a solution to problems that feel insurmountable. And it reveals something else, something perhaps more profound. A recognition that we are, in some sense, on trial, that the choices we make matter, that the path we are on is not inevitable, that alternatives exist, that change is possible if we are willing to pursue it, that if we are being watched, if someone is paying attention, we should act as though we are worthy of being watched. Whether Valiant Thor was a literal visitor, a Cold War hoax, or a symbolic warning disguised as a story is almost beside the point. Because the story endures not because of what it proves, but because of what it asks. It asks whether we are ready to listen, whether we are capable of change, whether we can set aside pride and fear and self-interest long enough to do what is necessary, even when what is necessary is difficult or uncomfortable or politically impossible. And it asks whether, if someone came to warn us, we would even hear them, or whether we would do exactly what the story says we did. Listen politely, nod in acknowledgement, file the warning away, and then go right back to what we were doing, trusting that somehow, despite all evidence to the contrary, everything will work out in the end. That is the real conspiracy. Not that an extraterrestrial came to Earth in the 1950s, but that if one did, we would do exactly what the story describes. We would be incapable of acting on the warning, not because we did not understand it or because we did not believe it, but because the structures and systems and incentives that govern human behaviour would make meaningful change impossible. We would hear the truth and be unable to act on it, and that perhaps is more frightening than any alien visitor could ever be. Valiant Thor may never have existed, but the fear that drove his story is real, and it is still with us, because the weapons are still here, the danger is still real, the path we are on has not fundamentally changed, even though the geopolitical landscape has shifted and the Cold War has ended, and new threats have emerged to replace the old ones. And the question Thor allegedly asked is still unanswered. What will we do with the power we have been given? What will we choose when the choice is between short-term security and long-term survival? Between maintaining the status quo and risking transformation? If someone came to warn us again, if a visitor appeared today with the same message that Thor allegedly delivered more than 60 years ago, would we listen? Would we act? Or would we do what we have always done? Turn away, close the file, return to our daily concerns, and hope that the silence means everything is fine, that the absence of immediate catastrophe means we have more time, that somehow, despite all the warnings and all the close calls and all the evidence that we are living on borrowed time, everything will work out. The Valiant Thor story is not about aliens. It is about us, about our capacity for denial, our resistance to change, our tendency to ignore warnings until it is too late. It is about the gap between knowing what needs to be done and being willing to do it, and that is why the story never dies. Because the gap remains, the question remains, the fear remains, and somewhere perhaps someone is still watching, still waiting, still hoping that we will prove worthy of the power we possess before it is too late.